She's a former Mackintosh Professor of English at Barnard College. She's probably best known for her novels, memoirs, and literary criticism. In 2008, Mary was named Official State Author of New York. Mary is the author of 7 best-selling novels. She's written 2 collections of stories, a book of essays, 2 memoirs, and that list goes on. Her first novel was Final Payments, where it became an immediate New York Times bestseller. So Mary's topic this evening is, what kind of Catholic are you? Her soon-to-be published new book. And this amazing read structure is to pair people who say that their worldviews are shaped by Catholicism, but their worldviews are diametrically opposed one to the other. So Mary will also share a little bit about her own journey in and out and in of the church. So please join me in welcoming Mary Gordon, the gifted author.
Can you hear me? Okay. I decided to write this book, What Kind of Catholic Are You?, because I was tired of people, some of whom I didn't know or knew only slightly, feeling free to walk up to me in public places and say, "How can you possibly be a Catholic?" Sometimes this preceded hello. In the worlds I largely inhabit, the academic and the literary, this is considered acceptable behavior. Of course, I understand why, and I am tempted to respond, for every reason you think the church is terrible, I can give you 10 more. But I have decided that this probably isn't the best approach, and so I have formulated a response that usually works to shut people up. I say, the terms are large. My accusers, I would say questioners, but in my experience, their tone doesn't suggest the desire for a considered answer, assume that if you are Catholic, you are homophobic, misogynistic, and anti-choice, and you think pedophilia is no big deal. I wanted to make the point that there is not one way of being Catholic, and I considered that an effective way of doing this was to pair people, each of whom said she or he had a worldview that was formed by their Catholicism, but the worldviews were diametrically opposed. I insist that the word "are" in the title, What Kind of Catholic Are You?, be printed in italics or boldface to indicate the tone in which the word is always said, accusatory. Because it is difficult for many Catholics to believe that people who disagree with them can be real Catholics. I am hoping to change the grammatical mode from the accusative to the genuinely interrogative. I had hoped that I would be able to speak directly to the people about whom I was writing, but this did not prove to be the case. I'm very grateful to those who gave me their time for direct interviews: Bill O'Reilly, Ross Douthat, Vincent Cunningham, Sister Simone Campbell, Father James Martin. Kellyanne Conway and Bishop Robert Barron answered my question, what is your favorite scriptural passage, who is your favorite saint, and what name did you take for confirmation? Mother Dolores Hart declined to speak to me in any way at all. I was ghosted, not by the third person of the Blessed Trinity, but by Stephen Colbert, Nancy Pelosi, Sonia Sotomayor, Amy Coney Barrett, and Pope Leo. Pretty distinguished ghosts. Because they had been interviewed and written about extensively, Barrett and Sotomayor have written memoirs, I felt secure enough that I had enough information to warrant my judgments. I am not a trained cultural historian, but a fiction writer, and so I try to understand the people about whom I wrote as I try to understand the characters I create, which is not to say I felt free to make stuff up. I pride myself that each of my assertions is well and thoroughly documented. What I mean is that I tried to create for each of the people I wrote about a nest that included questions of class, history, geography, important moments in their lives, both public and private. There's enough shared material to make the notion of a nest appropriate. When people talk about a Hail Mary play, all Catholics know the words. I'm a woman of the left and a committed feminist, and so I can well imagine that many people will find my conclusions untrustworthy and unsatisfactory. But because I was raised in an unquestionably conservative environment and have been taught and loved by people who would consider themselves on the right, as I once did, I like to think that I have some understanding of the issues that steer the lives of people with whom I might not agree. In reading and speaking to the people about whom I write, I have come up with a theory completely unprovable. People who define themselves as right-wing Catholics name their locus of dread disorder. People who consider themselves left-wing Catholics name their locus of dread repression. Therefore, people on the right feel comfortable with a certain amount of repression, and people on the left with a certain amount of disorder. My goal was to keep in mind the question that Simone Weil considered the most important: what are you going through? And to keep in mind the question, what do you find desirable? A secondary goal is to be able to say to importunate questioners, shut up and just read my book. So what kind of Catholic am I? My upbringing was steeped in and bound by a kind of Catholicism that is an historical artifact, as unavailable to the ordinary consumer as a wood-paneled station wagon. My parents were introduced by a priest. I was born on the Feast of the Immaculate Conception, which is often misunderstood. It doesn't celebrate Jesus being conceived free of sin. It celebrates Mary having been given that distinction. It is one of the 7 holy days of obligation. When I was growing up, Catholics were required to go to Mass on these holy days of obligation under pain of mortal sin. So if you were hit by a car and died on the day after a holy day and hadn't gone to Mass, you would go straight to hell, spending all eternity with Hitler and Stalin and Voltaire, who had more items on the Index of Forbidden Books than any other writer, and who was considered particularly pernicious because he was clever. I was a cesarean birth, and my mother chose the day of my birth deliberately so I would be born on a holy day and named Mary. The hospital in which I was born was a Catholic hospital, and my father was given the news of my birth by a nursing nun. My father grabbed her by the hand and pulled her to the chapel, where he insisted that they chant the Te Deum, the hymn of thanksgiving and praise. We praise thee, O God, we acknowledge thee to be the Lord. All the earth doth worship thee. It's been downhill from there. My parents' lives centered around their Catholicism, which for both of them was serious and thoughtful, but their Catholicisms were of very different stripes. My mother's Catholicism was not unusual for the time and place in which she was born, New York, 1908. Her parents were immigrants, she from Ireland, he from Sicily. Both left their native countries as teenagers. My grandmother traveled alone at 17. My grandfather was accompanied by his mother and sister at 13. My grandmother began life in America as a domestic servant and taught herself to use a sewing machine. She worked in a sweatshop. The young woman at the next machine was Sicilian and introduced my grandmother to her brother. They married to the displeasure of their respective families, who both considered that they were marrying foreigners and outsiders, despite the fact that both were Catholic. My grandmother was by far the dominant character in the family, so the kind of Catholicism in which my mother and her siblings were reared was unquestionably Irish, marked by an uncritical devotion to the clergy, a suspicion of religious enthusiasm, and a strong emphasis on sexual good behavior. My mother took her family's Catholicism a further step out into the larger world. She became involved in the working women's retreat movement in the 30s and 40s, which, unusual for its time, took the inner lives of women seriously and encouraged them to read and pursue a sophisticated religious life. She met my father in a convent where one of the retreats had taken place. He had been invited there by the priest who was running the retreat, a friend of my mother's, to whom my father had written accusing him of being too liberal. Somehow, by a process I cannot explain, my parents, joined by their religious seriousness, began dating. My father's Catholicism is more exotic. He was born a Jew in Lithuania and arrived in Ohio as a young child. I know very little about his early life. He died when I was 7, but more important, he invented a complex series of lies about his early life. He had been something of a playboy in the Cleveland of the 1920s, publishing under a pseudonym a softcore girly magazine called Hot Dog. At the same time, he was publishing literary articles in Harper's and the New Republic. By a path I am incapable of tracing, he next appears in print as a convert to Catholicism, writing in the Jesuit magazine America. So I'm pretty sure he came to church here, because America at that time was just down the block. He was noted for his support of Franco. For the rest of his life, he was devoted to a rabidly anti-communist, Europhilic version of Catholicism. Reader, they married. Having almost nothing in common except Catholicism and a sense of humor, they lived unhappily ever after, somehow managing to conceive me. My mother was 41 and a polio sufferer, so I was widely acknowledged as a miracle baby. We defined ourselves as a family not as Americans, but as Catholics. The important holidays were not Thanksgiving and the 4th of July, but holy days of obligation. We took pride and pleasure in going to Mass together, in visiting nuns in convents and priests in monasteries. One of my earliest memories is one we made to the Convent of Mary Reparatrix on 29th Street in Manhattan, the place my parents had met. While my mother was getting spiritual direction from one of the nuns, my father and I went into the chapel. Kneeling in front of the altar was a young nun. The habits of the Sisters of Mary Reparatrix were unusual in that they were neither black nor brown nor navy blue, but a vivid turquoise. The nun knelt in a pool of light which fell on her very white hands and the intense blue of her habit. And it came to me as a child of 5, this is what I want for myself. This is the desirable thing. The image has stayed with me as the icon of the desirable. I told my parents that when I grew up, I was going to enter the convent. My father explained to me that these sisters were called contemplatives. That is, their lives were devoted to prayer. They never left the convent like other nuns. They were not nurses or teachers. I imagined them in a constant state of illumination, and I wanted that for my future. I had learned to read at 3, and by 5, I was writing poems and stories with my father. And as he was a writer, I understood that I would be a writer too. A writer nun, alternately kneeling in light and writing beautiful words in beautiful books, sitting at a desk in front of a wall, in front of which hung a spare, elegant, and well-crafted crucifix. My father turned my career choice into a kind of party trick. He would say at parties, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I would answer, "A contemplative." The attention my parents gave to my first communion dwarfed the attention lavished by the British public on the coronation of Queen Elizabeth of England 4 years prior. My father told me that someone named Napoleon had said that his first communion was the most important day of his life. This led to finding pictures of someone on a rearing horse and others of a short man with his hand tucked inside his jacket. My parents stressed the amazing privilege of taking the body and blood of Christ into my own little body. They insisted that I would never be the same. There were 2 anxieties that preceded the great moment. One was that I had to make my first confession, And my mother, banishing my father, insisted that now I had to understand that at 6 years old I had sinned. Up to this point, I wasn't culpable for my sin, but having given me the privilege of First Communion, the church was acknowledging that I had now reached what was called the age of reason at 7. Now I was responsible for my sins and for making sure I never sinned again. My sin was something my mother called touching myself impurely. I had to confess it as my first confession, or my first communion would be a sin of sacrilege. I waited outside the confessional in a stew of shame and terror. I explained my sin. The priest seemed anxious to get me out of the confessional and gave me, as a penance, the negligible 3 Hail Marys. A dear friend of mine, a priest who made First Communion beside me, speculated that the priest was incredulous that a little girl would be guilty of such a horrible practice. My friend was threatened with hellfire by the same priest for confessing the same sin and warned of grave physical consequences in his future. My second anxiety stemmed from the regulation then in force that fasting was required from the midnight before the reception of communion. If by mistake you happened to eat something or even drink anything but water, you would be honor-bound not to receive communion. Receiving after eating was another sacrilege. I was so worried that I was afraid to brush my teeth, and I kept spitting on the sidewalk on the way to church in case I had somehow taken in too much toothpaste. I loved all the preparations. I took them as seriously as a general studying a battle plan. I loved myself all in white: dress, gloves, shoes, socks. I loved my laminated prayer book, the inside cover indented to contain a small plastic crucifix. I was proud of the way I walked, with my hands perfectly folded, inviolate as a Gothic steeple, not like some of my classmates who settled for a mishmash of interlocking fingers. There's a home movie of me processing into the church, my eyes demurely fixed on the ground in front of me. My father jumps out of the line of watching parents and calls my name. I cast him a withering look and unlock my perfect hands to give him a gesture of disapproval. And I did feel changed, illuminated, but it didn't last. Before long, I was back in the confessional. My father took me into the city regularly, a 40-minute train ride from our Long Island home, to see movies at Radio City and to visit St. Patrick's Cathedral, which he assured me was the equal of the great cathedrals of Europe. A stickler for perfect performance, I castigated him for putting his index finger into the holy water font when cradle Catholics like myself knew that the third finger was the proper one. He loved me for my exactitude, my seriousness, my perfect understanding of the details which could only be learned like a flawless accent from early childhood. My father and I were involved in a pact of mutual adoration. I now see that my mother had to play the bad guy, providing the discipline, although I was an extremely easy child, mostly interested in reading and making up stories for my dolls. I found my children my age distinctly inferior compared to my father. And then on January 14th, 1957, my father left the house for the city. He was at the 42nd Street Library at work on a biography of the ultra-conservative Catholic French poet Paul Claudel when he was stricken with a heart attack. He died in the hospital a month later, but in those days, children were not allowed in hospitals, and I never saw him again. My world went blank. I entered a kind of fugue state where nothing seemed real anymore. I understood that my identity in life was to be a perpetual mourner. The days after his death were my first occasion of religious questioning. I was numb with grief, but trying to be a good little soldier for my mother's sake, saving up my tears for privacy and bedtime. Some well-meaning but foolish person said to me, "You don't need to be sad. Your father is in heaven." And an alarm went off inside my brain, an alarm that has never stopped sounding. I knew that was wrong. I did need to be sad. I had lost the person I most loved in the world. That he was happy in heaven, I believed he was, had nothing to do with my sadness. I vowed then that I would not believe what I was told if I knew it to be wrong, particularly if it were anodyne, invoked to conceal or deny a dark truth. This is a practice I have clung to with what I have only recently understood are mixed results. When I was 10, I experienced my second crisis of doubt. I had just read a book about a courageous Chinese girl who was my age. I thought long and hard about what I thought might be the details of her life, particularly as she was living under godless communism. I was worried about what would happen to her after she died. There was no way she could have been baptized. There was a halfway house in the Catholic imagination for the righteous unbaptized. It was called Limbo. The residents didn't suffer, but neither did they experience the bliss of eternal connection with God. This seemed monstrously unfair to me. I asked a priest who was a friend of the family how God, who was said to love all his creatures, could relegate some of them to a distinctly inferior fate through no fault of their own. Perhaps to his credit, the priest pretended not to hear me and walked out of the room. When I reflect on the devotional practices I imposed on myself in those few years, nobody suggested these to me. I gleaned them from the lives of the saints that I devoured. I can't settle on a single interpretation. I veer between seeing them as a pathological manifestation of a pathological system, a comical, almost cartoon series, fodder for shtick, and a sense that the kind of obsessional and extreme focus that I practiced was a very good training for the life of a writer. I was very drawn to the life stories of virgin martyrs, but I also liked saints who had taken a difficult public stand. When I noticed that the boys playing on the street outside my house were using bad language, I called up the story of St. Dominic Savio, a 19th century Neapolitan orphan. When his fellow orphans were using language that he found blasphemous, he held up a crucifix and said to the boys, "Say it in front of him." The boys in my neighborhood did just that, unlike the Neapolitan orphans who fell to their knees. I had a particular fascination with stigmatists. Stigmatists were those people who received on their bodies the marks of the 5 wounds Jesus received on the cross, the nail marks in his hands and feet, the wound left by piercing his side by the Roman soldiers to ensure that he was dead. Stigmatists were considered especially blessed by God, chosen by him to re-experience his suffering in their own bodies. In the books I read, these women stigmatists were often not believed and had to endure the additional suffering of the cynicism of the official church. My mother had given me a small pink crucifix to take to bed. One morning, I awoke to find the imprint of a cross on my chest. I knew immediately what it was, the stigmata. I knew that I must keep calm and pray for guidance and thanksgiving. I proceeded downstairs to the breakfast table, a solemn look on my ennobled face. "Mother," I said, "I've got the stigmata." I opened my pajama top and showed my mother the imprint of the cross. "I'll be bleeding a lot on Friday," I said, "but don't worry." My mother, who was a devout but family commonsensical person, took one look and said, "You damn fool, you slept on your crucifix." I was undaunted, knowing that stigmatists were disbelieved, even by their families, but I was crestfallen to discover that after I took my morning bath, the stigmata seemed to have disappeared. I imposed penitential practices on myself, not only because I believed myself to be a great sinner, but also to train myself to withstand torture that might be imposed upon by communists. One Lent, I picked thorns from my grandmother's rosebush and put them in my shoes. Again, my mother put a stop to it, saying that she had spent good money on Buster Browns and there was no sense trying to cripple myself, as she had been crippled by polio. She was appalled by the idea that I might impose a similar fate on myself. I was actually relieved when she made me stop. I wasn't experiencing the glorious sensations that martyrs were supposed to be feeling. I just kept it up in case the communists were around the corner. It is impossible to exaggerate the importance of the Church's almost hysterical anti-communism in the American Catholicism of the 1950s. Because the world I inhabited contained no non-Catholics with whom we interacted seriously, the pharmacist was Jewish, the dry cleaner was Protestant, we had polite exchanges with them, but nothing more. I assumed that the threat of communism was directed only at Catholics. The Catholic media and the pulpits in every church presented terrifying stories of priests being tortured by communists. My mother actually knew a priest, a missionary to China, who had bamboo shoved under his fingernails, a blow against the venerable status of a priest's hands. I was obsessed by an image of the Hungarian Cardinal Mindszenty pacing the walls of what I would learn was the American embassy in Budapest. He had been tortured and imprisoned by the communist regime, and when freed by a more lenient government, instead of fleeing Hungary for a more comfortable life, he placed himself under the protection of the American embassy, a voluntary prisoner for 15 years. I thought he was great. We were told how fortunate we were to be in schools protected from the poison of public school teachers, any of whom could be a secret red. It wasn't until the image of Nikita Khrushchev banging his shoe on the table at the UN and shouting, "We will bury you," that I understood that the communist threat might apply to non-Catholics, even Protestants. In those years, Catholics mostly seemed to be against things. Something that we took a strong position against was something I didn't understand. It was called birth control, sometimes known as contraception. When I asked my mother why in the world, why anyone wouldn't want to have babies, she told me that I would understand when I was married. But I had no intention of getting married. I was going to be a nun. Nor did I have any understanding that birth control and my sins of impurity were about something called sex, which was an idea as foreign to me as astrophysics. There was a brief period, 1959 to 1963, when it was cool to be Catholic. It began with the election of Pope John XXIII. Many people believed that he would be an affable stopgap, preferably dying soon, until a satisfactory replacement for Pius XII could be found. He astonished everyone by calling a council of all the bishops of the world, the first in a century. The effects of Vatican II, which were the Church's attempts to come to terms with the modern world, to, quote, open the windows of the Church, created a revolution whose effects reverberate to this day. I love this Pope. On my wall, I pasted the cover of Life magazine that had featured him. I wrote a poem to him that was published in our parish magazine, and my mother sent a copy to the Vatican. Here are 2 lines from this masterpiece of juvenilia. His tedious task, but one he loves, is care of Christian souls, and to unite all men in Christ is one of his great goals. I received a form letter from the Pope thanking me. It is one of my most prized possessions, the value of which has not diminished over time. In 1960, John F. Kennedy ran for and was elected president. There were things finally we could be for instead of against, even if JFK seemed to lean more to the left than my mother and my friends were comfortable with. I heard her assuring a friend that a vote for Kennedy was the right choice. Well, she said, he is a pinko, but if he has to push the button, you know he'd have the guidance of the Holy Ghost. But the Bay of Pigs made us think that maybe we had taken our eyes off the prize too easily. All the students in my school were sent to church to spend the day in prayer rather than doing schoolwork. We were terrified. Then it was 1963. In June of that year, on my way home from a school field day, we heard a radio broadcasting on the bus that Pope John had died. I felt abandoned once again by a loving father, the roly-poly papa who had replaced the austere Pius XII. November 22nd, the young president is shot. The world darkens. The smiling Pope and President have been replaced by the grimacing Paul VI and the frowning LBJ. A place called Vietnam entered the conversation. Catholics, following the flamboyant leadership of Francis Cardinal Spellman of New York, a close friend of President Diem of South Vietnam, whose brother was a cardinal, supported the war. As Catholics, we were automatically against communists whose major goal in life was to destroy the Catholic Church. In that same year, kneeling in my usual penumbra of self-loathing to confess my perennial sin, I experienced a miracle. I had entered the wrong confessional, believing that I was confessing to a visiting priest who didn't know me and who would be gone after Mass the next morning. Somehow, though, it was the gentle young priest who had been a great help in my family during my grandmother's long illness. I don't know whether he recognized me, but he told me to stop worrying about what I thought was a sin, that it wasn't a sin. It was something that was very common, and that I should concentrate instead on the boundless love of God and the love that had been given to me by the people around me. The shock was so great that my first impulse was a desire to vomit. But between my saying my penance of 3 Hail Marys at the altar and my reaching the outdoors, in my memory the sun fell on me, clarifying, warming. I felt a lightness that I had never before felt. It turns out that I was not a sinner. Then I went to high school. I began to have friends. I began to get a crush. I stopped writing on paper napkins Sister Mary Dolorosa of the Eternal Sorrows and wrote Mrs. Joseph Montalbano instead. I now had friends and a music that my mother hated, and a desire no longer to be a virgin on my wedding night. I had, at 16, a desire to start a literary magazine, which had never been started before in my high school. A friend of mine who had chosen the University of Chicago, on her Christmas vacation, took me to a poetry reading of Allen Ginsberg. I was enthralled, both by his poetry and by his chanting. As a proof of my radical unwisdom, I thought it would be a good idea to include a rapturous review of Allen Ginsberg in the new literary magazine. My page-long exaltation of uninflected praise included the words, "And if there were any nearby swine, I am afraid that they would go beetling over the cliffs and into the sea," a reference to Jesus' curing of the demoniac, transferring his demons into swine, who then crashed to their deaths. The nun whom I thought was my ally was furious. She went beet red with rage through the page I had typed at me. Scrawled in the middle of it in red ink was the word blasphemy. She said, "Now there will be no literary magazine." For a reason I cannot call back, I wasn't abashed. I was determined. I had a plan. Next week, the honors English students of the Diocese of Brooklyn had been invited to a poetry reading by Father Daniel Berrigan, who was at that time in the Catholic world I inhabited, not known as an activist, but as a poet. When he finished his reading, I elbowed my way to the front of the room and grabbed his arm. I gave him a copy of my Ginsberg review, complete with the red accusation defacing it. I also gave him some of my poems with my name and address on him, and told him that because of what I had written about Ginsberg, our literary magazine had been suppressed. With a generosity that astonishes me, more than 60 years later, Father Berrigan wrote me a letter that said, "You are a poet, and you are going to have to make your own way on your own roads." Bristling with righteous exultation, I presented the letter to the nun. We got our literary magazine. And another door opened because of Father Berrigan, which I have never had the temptation to close. I began to read negative criticism of the Vietnam War, and I learned about the civil rights movement, neither of which had been mentioned in my school. It suddenly seemed terrible to me that we were killing people who were only trying to govern themselves, and that we were discriminating against people because of the color of their skin. I became an anti-war person and started going to demonstrations secretly, never letting my mother know. That same year, I discovered a writer that people seemed to think was important. His name was J.D. Salinger. I discovered The Catcher in the Rye, but I was obsessed with the books and stories that centered on the Glass family, a family of geniuses who were steeped in literature and philosophy, an Irish-Jewish clan whose Upper West Side apartment's rent was paid by their father, a Broadway agent. I couldn't be one of the Glass family, I knew that, but I thought there might be a way that I could meet them, befriend them, perhaps even marry Seymour and save him from suicide. Salinger's vision had nothing to do with Catholicism, although one of the Glass brothers did become a monk, but we know nothing about him. It was New York and Jews and Eastern religion and an intellectually inflected mysticism that also had something to do with show business. This was the world I wanted. So by 1966, I had Salinger and friends and music my mother hated and a growing impatience with the Catholic agenda that permeated every subject I was taught. History was taught from the perspective of Catholicism. The Protestant Reformation was called the Protestant Revolt. The Crusades were a triumph of the reign of God. Even the one excellent teacher I loved had to push Catholic writers as somehow superior. Gerard Manley Hopkins was superior to someone called Walt Whitman, who was writing at the same time, but we had no need to bother with. 20th century poetry was represented not by Yeats, Eliot, and Pound, but by an English Catholic poet named Alice Meynell. Somehow, Joyce's story, Araby, made it into the anthology that was our 9th grade text, and I remember the exultation I felt when I read it and the pleasure my excellent teacher took at my excitement. But we were told that the highest reaches of modern fiction were achieved by Graham Greene and Evelyn Waugh. And somehow, with a kind of intuition that I am not afraid of calling grace, I knew that if I was going to be the kind of writer I wanted to be, I had to ignore that agenda. I had to be near Jews. In the year between 1963, when I entered high school, and 1967, when I entered college, I rejected the church's teaching on premarital sex and birth control. I no longer feared communism as an ever-present life-threatening threat. The doubts I had as a child about heaven being denied the unbaptized, my unease with the anodyne explanations offered for human suffering, came to the center of my vision and overshadowed positive aspects of the faith that had nourished me. What surprises me, thinking of those years, was how little ambivalence I felt about jettisoning so much that I believed essential to my identity and eternal salvation. I determined to go to Barnard, the Women's College of Columbia, where I would meet Seymour Glass and learn to be the kind of writer that I wanted to be. And so I went to Barnard. Walking through the gates on Broadway, I felt that I was walking through the gates of paradise. I knew no other Catholics at Barnard except the 2 friends from my high school who accompanied me on this great adventure. I had no impulse to go to Mass. The Vietnam War was heating up. The Columbia riots happened in my freshman year. I protested by day and took the train home to my mother at night. How was your day? Fine. Pope Paul VI wrote the encyclical Humanae Vitae that condemned birth control, and for me, the authority of the church evaporated like a stream that had been exposed to a prolonged drought. My primary group identity was as a feminist. My years away from the church are not nearly so singular as my years in it. They're rather generationally typical. I inhabited a Catholic free world. The moral hypocrisy of the hierarchy and the male-inflected aura around the Catholic left gave me no foothold. I only went to Mass when I was home with my mother, and I absented myself psychologically and spiritually from the experience to such a degree that I might well as not have been there. I went to graduate school and spent 3 years with no connection to anyone or anything Catholic. I married an Englishman, an anthropologist who prided himself on believing that all religion was a primitive enactment of the fear of death. We moved to the mid-Hudson Valley, where he taught at the State University of New Paltz. After 3 years of sodden marital misery, I fell in love with a colleague of my then-husband's, a scholar of 18th century literature whose work on Lawrence Sterne, the author of Tristram Shandy, had steered her from ACLU agnosticism to a fervent Episcopalian faith. We flirted. He convinced me to attend Good Friday services with him, and I wept furtively. I had never given up the habit of prayer, but I realized how much I missed having a place in which to pray and people to pray with. The power of liturgy to put me in touch with what the 17th century poet George Herbert calls a kind of tune that all things hear and fear. I left my husband and married the man with whom I would make a life for 40 years, the father of my 2 children, who died hearing my daughter and me singing his favorite hymn. For 5 years or so, I knelt happily beside him, a member of the Episcopalian congregation, where he was an important leader. Of course, I kept this from my mother. Somehow being a Catholic has made many of us expert liars. The loophole called a mental reservation. You're lying, but you have created some linguistic web in your own mind that allows you to lie without sin because you know you're lying. When the traveling salesman comes and says, "Is your mother home?" you say she's not home, even though she is, because in her mind you have said she is not home to you. When we visited my mother in Long Island, I went to Mass with her and felt keenly the inferiority of the liturgy, the music, the sermons, in comparison with my elegant, stimulating, and lovely Episcopalian experience. In 1983, after my second child was born, my mother retired and I bought her a house 2 blocks from my own. I had to double dip on Sundays, taking her to Mass at the Catholic Church after I had my Episcopalian fix. And then at her church, I met the Franciscan priests who went out of their way to make my mother feel welcome in her new situation. And it occurred to me that the Episcopalian church where I'd felt comfortable was really a little clubby. The people who formed the majority of the congregation were well-educated, white, healthy, and relatively Protestant, and relatively prosperous. And that I felt a kind of comfort in the Catholic Church with its mixed population, with the parish fundraising events saturated with an easygoing and fun-loving vulgarity, cotton candy, games where you won stuffed animals, calzones, and cheap beer. The kind of thing that would have alienated my tasteful Episcopalian friends. And then in 1990, I was hired on the faculty of my beloved Barnard, and we moved to New York. In the same way that my becoming a Barnard student had shut out my Catholicism, my time on a Barnard faculty, not because of Barnard, but because it was in New York, allowed me to meet people, some of whom are in this audience, who provided me a path to a bumpy, uneasy, and gradual return. The religious term for these encounters is grace. I have not been able to imagine another institution that can provide the possibilities that make up this package I so revere, nor can I imagine one that has the breadth and range to allow people of all classes and all levels of education, all degrees of prosperity, cleanliness, and mental health to be together in the same room, saying the same prayers that people have said for centuries. Only Catholicism provides a situation that allows us to enter a church anywhere in the world and feel at home. The Catholic Church is Catholic, not bound by nationalities or language. There are many days when I wish I could think of a substitute. I remember Carly Simon's song, "Nobody Does It Better, Sometimes I Wish Someone Could." Because along with an appreciation of unique gifts, there is the necessary understandings that the Catholic Church nurtures positions that cause incalculable harm. The pedophilia scandal is perhaps the most glaring of these, but the damage done to women and to LGBTQ Catholics could fill all the great cathedrals that were built in its name. The American Catholic hierarchy's single-minded focus on abortion leads them to ignore other social justice questions, immigrations, the death penalty, and the environment, which they say they care about, but they vote with their feet. This enrages me and causes me something close to despair. And there are many days when the suffering of the world, not just evil like the Holocaust, but more particularly the pain of animals, make me refuse the possibility of a loving God. But finally, I don't believe that such a refusal would lead to a richer life. Without a religious life, I would be unable to imagine words to express my gratitude for the great good fortunes that have made of my life, or an ear to hear them. Without a religious frame of reference, some words are leached of meaning: lamentation, ultimate, sacred. There are physical gestures that only a religious practice enables: prostration in the face of unbearable grief, kneeling in awe of the universe. I refuse certainty, but I have decided at least for now, to take Pascal up on his wager. Quote, "Let us weigh the gain and the loss in wagering that God is. Let us estimate these two chances. If you gain all. If you lose nothing. Wager then, without hesitation, that he is." And I invoke the words of Gerard Manley Hopkins in his great poem, The Wreck of the Deutschland. I greet him the days that I meet him, and bless when I understand. Thank you. Sure. So she was asking me about the younger people who now seem to, as she calls it very well, performative Catholicism, kneeling. The mentees are true enough to actually give me a nervous breakdown. And I do write about them. When I write about Ross Douthat and a group of what I call the Theo Bros, like J.D. Vance being chief among them, and Patrick Deneen and Adrian Vermeule, and a whole bunch of younger people that are basically terrified and grip onto a Catholicism that they don't understand very well, but they're going to hold on because, you know, the world is so terrible. And they also want a lot of white babies. So that's a really big goal for that particular generation. Yes, so my friend here just asked that most of the people that I interviewed were older, and was I talking about anybody younger, and Douthat was the youngest. He's only 45. To my horror, he's the same age as my daughter. Yeah. Well, the connection is an absolute terror that the major impulse toward that kind of anti-communism and toward this kind of Christian nationalism is terror, a sense of being overwhelmed, and that the only thing that can keep you from complete disintegration is to just hold on to this tradition, which you assume has not changed at all, which is nonsense. But, you know, they pride themselves on being historic, these right-wing guys. They pride themselves on really loving tradition, but their view of history is unbelievably crude and unbelievably vulgar. So, for example, Ross Douthat believes that the church has always been against slavery. Well, that's just not true. During the Civil War, the Catholic Church backed the Confederacy, for example. So I actually feel sorry for them because they wake up every morning, well, I wake up every morning terrified, but I have a sense of humor. They wake up every morning feeling that chaos is about to engulf them. And I think as a species, we're all overwhelmed by all the changes that we've had to absorb in the last 50 years. But they just think the best way to deal with change is to hold on to a fantasy of the past, which is not the past, but it's their fantasy of the past because they're scared out of their wits. And I don't know where faith comes in, that it doesn't seem to dilute their terror at all. I wouldn't want to be them. Maybe they're having a good time, I don't know. Yes?
Started off by saying that the right wing has a locus of dread that is disorder, left wing generally has a locus of disorder with dread that is oppression. Do you find any difference in the depth or thoroughness with which each side explores this self-reflective perspective?
Great question. The question, what my idea, which is only my idea, that the focus, the locus, what I call the locus of dread for right-wing Catholics is chaos and disorder, and the locus of dread for left-wing Catholics is repression. So your question is, did I find anybody who might go along with that and might want to question their position? Is that what you're saying? I'm going to reveal what's probably my prejudice. So I look at Bill O'Reilly, who has the self-reflection of a bay scallop. And I look at somebody like Father James Martin or Sister Simone Campbell or Sotomayor. And to me, they are much more self-reflective. Now, you get people like Bishop Barron who pretend to be self-reflective, but actually go back to this very crude notion of history where all questions can be answered because the church has not changed in 2,000 years, which just isn't true. So people who don't like me might say but I think that the whole habit of critical questioning is something that people on the right aren't real fans of. And they prefer authority. They love authority. Critical questioning is scary because you could be wrong. And they really love a fantasy of something that has never been wrong and can never be wrong. So I think temperamentally, and you know, I'm sure other people would argue with me that we on the left can be equally doctrinaire and equally inflexible. I know that we can. But I think temperamentally, we're a little bit more comfortable with questioning than people on the right. But I'm a person of the left, so of course I think that. come to Mass, although, you know, you don't want to be in hell with all those bad people that didn't go to Mass on holy days of obligation. I'm happy to say that there is, on my birthday, because it's a holy day of obligation, alternate side of the street parking is suspended. So.
And the fact that church is very like